So our first order of business is requests for bill introductions. It's wrong here on the agenda. Are there any bill introductions? This is the last day, so. Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the next order of business, which is the approval of the minutes for January 21st and 23rd. The chair would entertain a motion on that. Okay, Representative Chauncey moves the passage of the minutes and the Vice Chairman seconds. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The minutes are passed. Okay, our next order of business is a hearing on House Bill 2021. I'm going to ask the conferees to please try to keep your testimony to 4 minutes because I'm hoping that we can do some work on a bill previously heard after the hearings today. But with that, I'll ask the reviser to give us an overview of the bill.
Mike Heim with the Reviser of Statutes Office. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This bill dealing with ballot boxes has been around for a couple of years. The House Bill 2021 would provide Secretary of State, after consultation with the county election officers, shall adopt rules and regulations for the use of remote ballot boxes by the county election office for return of advance voting ballots. There's a definition of remote ballot box. In the last couple of years, the Senate has passed a bill that would abolish the use of ballot boxes. There's bills been introduced to limit the number of ballot boxes by the population of a county and so on. So anyway, this is a topic that has been around the legislature for the past couple of years.
Are there any questions for the reviser? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and sorry for my tardiness. Mike, thanks for the overview. I had a couple questions in reviewing this. It appears that in this bill, could the Secretary of State, not saying that they would, but could the Secretary of State just ban drop boxes if they identify that as a rule?
The way it reads, it says adopt rules and regulations for the use of ballot boxes. I think the prohibition would not be part of, that would be beyond what the statute allows.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, one last question is it the intention of this to just, could they change the rules after January 1st, 2026, or is it like a one-time only?
Rules and regulations can be changed. There's a process and so on. It would have to go through the same process of rules and regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'd just make the point that right now, and I'm sure the conferees are going to make the same point, the Secretary of State doesn't have this authority right now. So right now there are no rules or regulations for ballot drop boxes. Representative Berquist.
Thank you. And this would not then present a requirement to have boxes, but if they had boxes, they'd be regulated. Is that correct?
Correct. There's no requirement unless the rules and regulations require them, but it doesn't require ballot boxes. It just requires a regulation.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for the reviser? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Our first, I'll open proponent testimony, and our first conferee is Clay Barker. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel for the Kansas Secretary of State. For those of you that aren't familiar with this is the 4th year this or a similar bill has come up to give the Secretary regulation authority over remote boxes. And each time the House overwhelmingly passes it, the Senate amends the bill up, it comes back and dies, so we're trying once more. So right now the status quo is remote boxes can be used by counties if they want, but there is no minimal standards. There's only guidance on how to use them. We're requesting authority because we believe a plausible basis to issue regulations, but the Secretary said unless it's clear from the legislature that we have the authority, he's not going to go out there, so that's why we're asking for it. We only want to issue regulations in 3 areas, and if you work the bill and want to limit our authority to these, we're fine with that. One is security. essentially 24/7 video and some other provisions, chain of custody on ballots that go in and taken out, and access for accessibility for disabilities. Some quick background. Boxes were authorized in 1978 by statute in a generic way. In 2020, there was a large increase. In my testimony, I put how many boxes are used by counties. Most either have none, one, or two. Sedgwick has the most at 14, and Johnson, the most populous county, only uses 8. We've got 11 major elections in a row without any incident with the remote boxes, and there's never been a report of a ballot in a remote box that wasn't requested by a properly registered voter. There's no evidence of ballot stuffing or ballot harvesting or anything along those lines. The only thing that's changed since the 70s is the Postal Service is getting slower and slower, and the Kansas time period from when ballots are mailed out to when they have to be returned is fairly short. And the voters that use mail ballots, it's about 10 to 15% of the voters, generally elderly people, need a place to be able to return them if they can't trust the mail. And they can take it to a polling place, but those aren't always open, but the boxes are. And I would also note that the people that put out the somewhat infamous movie 2,000 Mules, which alleged mass misuse of boxes, have apologized for the inaccuracies of the movie and taken it down. That happened last year. If this bill is not passed, we'll just stick with the status quo, that boxes will continue to be used by counties, but there's just guidance and no minimal enforceable standards. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Barker? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I'm just curious, because of the security you mentioned would be something of a standard that you would want to follow up. Are there any, do the counties or anybody else have like security obligations? Are they left open? Do they do it, do they man them 24/7? What's going on right now with these boxes?
Representative, we have issued guidance to the counties, what we think they should be doing. It's not enforceable. The counties, as far as I know, all follow it, and that's that the boxes should be under 24/7 video surveillance. And a lot of counties will put them, for instance, at an entrance to a library that already has a camera, or outside the courthouse or the sheriff's office.
Is there any other questions for Mr. Barker? Mr. Vice Chairman. Now I'm doing it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barker, you have your remote box use in recent elections. Was that the 2020 election or the 2024? Those numbers for each by county, about who used none, who used one?
Mr. Vice Chair, that was the 2024 election numbers. Okay, plus or minus 1. I took also some older numbers there.
And if I could follow up, so in comparison to 2020, I mean, was it just identical to what was done in 2020, or is it, was there less? Was there what?
Virtually identical. Some counties added one, some took away one. I think Wyandotte added 2 or 3 after complaints from some of their voters that they were a large county that hadn't used many, and they increased it a little bit.
All right. I just know, I know Reno County had used 3, but just dropped it to 1, just so they could have something just strictly in front of the courthouse.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Barker? Okay, so in the interest of making sure I understood what you just said, because when the Secretary of State comes in here and says something, it gets quoted, or the Secretary of State's office. When you said, there's no evidence of ballots that were not requested by a voter showing up in ballot boxes, you also said there's no evidence of ballot harvesting. What do you mean when you say that?
Mr. Chair, I understand your question. By ballot harvesting, I meant illegally collecting ballots from people and then putting them in the drop box in the middle of the night by people who didn't intend to vote, forging their signatures, not somebody taking more than 10 ballots and carrying them in.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but right now we don't really have a mechanism to enforce that 10 ballot limit. Is that correct?
It's difficult, Mr. Chair, because the person is supposed to sign the back of the ballot envelope, but if they don't, there'd be no way of knowing. That's why the video camera's there, but even that, you can't always tell.
All right, thank you very much. I just wanted to, I could already see the quotes on the article from some paper, I don't know which paper, that, you said there's no ballot harvesting occurring, so.
And of course, there's no security on the blue postal boxes. People can just put ballots in there without.
Fair enough. Are there any other questions for Mr. Barker? Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Our next conferee is Mr. Jay Hall. Welcome to the committee. Or maybe not. Yeah. Standby committee. Okay, I'm now with the mic on. Is there anybody wishing to speak neutral on House Bill 2021? Okay, seeing none, I'll close neutral testimony. Committee, I have nobody listed as an in-person oral testimony as an opponent. I am not going to read all the names, but I'll direct your attention to several, perhaps numerous opponents to the bill with written-only testimony. Is there anybody wishing to speak as an opponent? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to close the hearing on House Bill 2021. Committee, if there's no objection, I would like to reopen the order of business introduction of bills. Is there any objection to doing that? Okay, seeing none, is there any bill request for bill introduction? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for the flexibility. I would like to introduce for committee 25 RS 0907. 25 RS 0907. It's concerning advanced voting centers and establishing requirements for counties to, in 4 counties, large counties in Kansas, to have a minimum number of drop boxes. So, thank you.
Okay, committee, are there any questions or objections to introduction? Okay, seeing none, the bill will be introduced just under the wire. All right. All right, I'm going to move to the next order of business, which is a hearing on House Bill 2054. Before you go, Elena, if you don't mind, I'd like the revisor to tell everybody what it's about, and then I'll have you next. So, Mr. Revisor, you mind giving us a rundown on this bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is a bill that raises the limits on campaign contributions for the general elections as well as for the primary elections. I've submitted a late to the secretary a summary, which you'll have access to, but the short version of it is that we've doubled the amount of contributions that can be made for both the primary and the general elections for the governor, the lieutenant governor, members of the House, district judge, district magistrate judge, district attorney, candidate for local office, and so on, state senator, members of the Board of Education, and so forth, and then deleted limitations on amounts contributed by a state party committee or a national party committee and so on. The fiscal note, I think, does a good job of summarizing what's in the bill. I will make, and I think the research department's going to get into the details, but in 1989, there were actually a reduction from the amounts that are in the law there was $750 were some of the limits. They reduced it to $500 and so on. There's been a checkered history about this, but the bottom line is it's been over 30 years since there's been a increase in these amounts.
Are there any questions for the revisor? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask Ms. Redder to come up and everybody be gentle with her. She's pinch hitting for Jillian today, so please treat her with kid gloves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Elena Rutter with Legislative Research. I am pinch hitting for Jillian Block today. And I am going to be presenting from this memo about Alaska's campaign contribution limits and how those have changed over time and what their current situation is like. So in 1996 in Alaska, the Alaska Legislature enacted a revised campaign finance law with the purpose of restoring the public's trust in the electoral process and to foster good government. Among other things this law did, one thing it did was decrease contribution limits by individuals to candidates, limited contributions by individuals to a group that is not a political party, and limited the annual aggregate combination or contribution amount candidates can accept from non-residents of Alaska. And then in 2003, the Alaska Legislature again revised the law and raised contribution limits for individuals back to $1,000. A couple years later, the Alaska voters considered ballot measure 1. And this ballot measure again decreased contribution limits by individuals back to $500. Decreased, those were 2 candidates, and then individuals, 2 political parties was decreased to $5,000. Contribution limits by groups, 2 candidates were also decreased, and from groups to political parties. And again, limited the annual aggregate contribution amount a candidate could accept from a non-resident of Alaska. On the top of page 2, there is a statement that was included in the voter information packet regarding ballot measure number 1. And then it was approved on August 22nd, 2006 by Alaska voters. 73% were in favor of this ballot measure. Later on down the road in 2015, a group of individuals and a subdivision of the Alaska Republican Party brought a First Amendment challenge to the contribution limits set by ballot measure 1. The plaintiffs sought a declaratory judgment and challenged the provisions as unconstitutional. They wanted a permanent injunction prohibiting enforcement of the challenge provisions, and then they also asked for costs and attorney's fees. The district court granted the state's motion for partial summary judgment for lack of standing, and then on the rest of the issues, they rejected the plaintiff's claims. The district court determined that each of the 4 challenges was aimed at the important state interest of combating quid pro quo or its appearance, and was closely drawn to meet that interest. On the top of page 3, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard an appeal from the plaintiffs, and they reviewed the district court's findings, and the Ninth Circuit held that the individual and political party contribution limits were indeed closely drawn to serve the state interest of combating quid pro quo corruption or its appearance, but they determined that the district court erred in upholding the non-resident aggregate contribution limit, and that was related to the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions in Citizens United and McCutcheon. The plaintiffs then again appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court vacated the judgment of the Ninth Circuit and remanded the case, and recommended the Ninth Circuit revisit whether Alaska's contribution limits were consistent with their First Amendment precedents, specifically Randall v. Sorrell. The U.S. Supreme Court also stated that in Randall v. Sorrell, they saw several danger signs about Vermont's law, which they held was unconstitutional. From the contribution limits were unconstitutionally low, and they said that Alaska's limits were similar, that they were substantially lower than limits that the Supreme Court had previously upheld, were lower than other limits in other states, and it was not adjusted for inflation. In 2021, when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case again on remand, then they held that the $500 individual to candidate limit, the $500 individual to group limit, and the non-resident aggregate contribution violated the First Amendment. However, the political party to candidate limit did not violate the First Amendment. So at this point in time, the only piece of ballot measure 1 that is constitutional and still law in Alaska is the political party to candidate limit. And then in 2020, ballot measure number 2 was proposed, and it made more changes to campaign finance law in Alaska, among other changes. And if you would like information on what those other changes were, I'd be happy to get that for you too. And those changes in ballot measure 2 were to address the use of dark money in elections. This ballot measure was approved by Alaska voters by a very slim margin of 50.55% to 49.45%. And then the campaign finance provisions of this ballot measure were also challenged for constitutionality. However, the district court, the Ninth Circuit, and the Supreme Court, the district court and the Ninth Circuit both held that they were not unconstitutional, and then the Supreme Court denied to hear the case in November of 2024. So on page 5, we are going to talk about the current campaign contribution limits in Alaska. And as I mentioned, currently there are no limits on individual contributions or non-resident contributions. In an article posted by Alaska Public Media, and according to data that they found on Open Secrets, at the end of July 2024, at least 5 state candidates for either the House or Senate had reported contributions of $10,000 or more from a single donor. And there are some examples from that article at the top of page 5. One was an attorney from Anchorage donated a total of more than $30,000 to 2 candidates. And right now in Alaska, there has been a bill introduced, HB 16, and it would establish campaign contribution limits for individuals, groups that are not political parties and non-group entities. This bill has not had a hearing yet, and no other action has been taken on it as of today. And then there is a proposed ballot initiative that could appear on the general election ballot in 2026 in Alaska that would establish campaign contribution limits for individuals and political parties. And at the bottom of page 6, the organizer of the campaign for this ballot initiative said that the initiative would reinstate fair, reasonable, and constitutional campaign contribution limits, which are adjusted for inflation moving forward, ensuring these limits remain constitutional. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll do my best.
And thank you, Ms. Rudder. The reason I had research do this, I met a legislator from Alaska at an NCSL election event, and he told me this story about how they lost all of their limits because the court, and of course the Ninth Court is not biting on us, but they had essentially the same limits that were ruled unconstitutional, and they weren't able to pass something, and so now they've just got no limit at all. And so that was the intent of having her go through that. Are there any questions for Ms. Rudder? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. All right, I'm going to proceed to proponent testimony, and the first conferee that I have listed is Mr. Rob Fillion. Welcome to the committee.
Field. Oh, sorry. Rookie mistake. Campaign contribution limits inadvertently create an uneven playing field. If you have to rely on contributions at these low levels while your gas and your stamps are going up, the people who can self-fund don't have to worry about that. That gives an uneven playing field to the wealthy that can self-fund or give themselves loans for competing for one of these seats. The second major portion of this bill is giving money to the state party. This is one of the bigger portions of the bill that doesn't often get talked about, but this is a way of creating transparency. Right now, this money that can't be given to state parties is going to 501c4s, PACs, and other dark money, as they call it, where you don't have to list your donors. You're not responsible. You're not held accountable. And so bringing this money back to the state parties is very transparent. The second portion of that is, as you guys know, this last cycle, we had a primary that was funded by the state government. 4 years before that, we had a caucus system. The caucus system relies solely on state parties to fund the caucus system. These are very, very expensive endeavors. That, if we cannot give money, if our contributors cannot give money to the state party, then how are we going to have that? How are we going to have smoothly ran caucuses if there are limits on this? So with that, I'll end. I know you have much more brilliant people speaking on behalf of this, but I will stand for questions.
Committee, in the interest of time, I'm going to have all the proponents testify, and then we'll call them up for questions as you'd like to ask questions. Thank you very much. Our next conferee is Josh Nye. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a proposal that the interim committee in 2023 provided as a bipartisan, unanimous proposal to look at candidate campaign contribution limits. I did the inflation calculator just sitting here to see what $500 would be in 2025, and that's about a little over $1,200. So even doubling the House or district attorney levels won't even get to what inflation would have done. So I really want to zoom in to what I think you should consider as far as amendments to this as you discuss. These aren't necessarily recommended amendments. I just want to kind of to scope out what I think the bounds of the debate should be. And really that comes down to, in my conclusion, asking the question, what is the public policy purpose of any campaign finance prohibition or restriction? We're not just talking about transparency, but we're talking about thou shalt not here. And these are Class A misdemeanors if you violate it. And so that really comes down to what courts have seen as quid pro quo and corruption. So it makes sense why a candidate would, if you're going to give money to a candidate, that direct line between a donor and a candidate is the quickest way towards untoward behavior. If you can give unlimited amounts to a candidate or something like that, that's the government official that will be voting. But as you start getting farther and farther away from it with political committees and party committees, and then even C4s, everyone knows that there are these different types of non-candidate committees are supporting candidates in one way or the other, or at least engaging in issue advocacy that holds out the issues and may even have the likeness of the candidate, but doesn't use those express words, those magic words of express advocacy. And so I think that you need to ask the question, why are we putting limits on parties? I think that there are distinctions between parties and PACs. PACs you can give unlimited amounts of money to, and unlike C4s, PACs have to say where they got their money from. They have to list their donors. But party committees uniquely can coordinate in a general election. And they also can give money, or the contribution limits don't really apply to parties in a general election. They do in a primary currently. And so there is a distinction there that I think that you all should debate when you work the bill. But the idea of getting rid of party limits ultimately is putting them on the same playing field that C4s and that PACs currently have, which is there is no contribution limit, but PACs can't coordinate. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I would ask you to look at is the idea of primary contributions are currently capped by, in law for political parties to give to candidates in a primary. Interestingly, in the law, there's nothing, and the reviser can check me on this, but I don't think there's any prohibition on a Republican Party giving to a Democratic primary candidate, or a Democratic Party giving to a Republican Party candidate. So you may want to tweak that a little bit just to say, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and let's make it consistent. So really that comes down to my recommended amendments. I would also want you to consider in the same statute striking the prohibition of use of funds for federal political office. This is the Trump signs or the Kamala signs issue that popped up around the state where technically a state party can't buy presidential signs. When that's the most demanded thing in a presidential cycle. The KGEC actually has asked you to strike this several times, and I actually agree with that. But I'll stand with that and just say, at the end of the day, ask yourself, in the context of the First Amendment, what are we trying to do here, and what are we trying to prohibit? And if the answer to that is, we don't really want the parties to have that much speech, that's unconstitutional. If there's a quid pro quo or corruption angle to that, that's when we can start looking at prohibitions.
All right, thank you very much for your testimony.
Be in another committee, so.
Okay. Well, are there any questions for Mr. Nye before he takes off? Okay, Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for your testimony here today. You made mention, you said that it was bipartisan and unanimous. What were you referring to?
Interim committee report in 2023, October. It was talked about, I think, at earlier hearing as far as an overview of that.
Okay. I know you. I work with you, so I want to just pick your brain on a couple of things. We did bipartisan and unanimous. I think the previous conferee brought up the primary that was paid for by the state versus the caucus situation. We did that legislation because that was at the behest of the parties as well, the state parties, in order to pay for their primaries with state coffer funds instead of them raising their own funds to pay for their caucuses. And that also was bipartisan and unanimous. So that standard, it seems to be something that you're, not you personally, but that the proponents are railing against. I have a little bit of pause and concern here. The first question I would ask you, sir, is why do we have these limits as they currently stand? What was the purpose of them?
Which limits?
On contribution, candidate and contributions.
Candidate limits, I think that the idea has been, even in First Amendment litigation, that there is an interest, a significant interest that the government has in preventing buying off governmental officials. So when I give you $500, or if I could give you $10,000 or $20,000, there would be at least the appearance that you're going to vote based on the donations. And so that's the idea of putting limits on candidates. But as you get farther and farther away from the governmental official, the question starts popping up that whether we're really deterring that, or we just don't like a lot of speech, or we're just trying to keep money from being involved in politics. And fortunately or unfortunately, the Constitution says money is speech. So you as legislators are always going to be running up against the Constitution as to what you can and can't do.
Okay. And if you give me a little, thank you, sir. If the candidates that are filing for office, right, would you say that that's a threshold that they put in place in order to have more speech from the constituency, from the citizens, to vie for office, instead of making the threshold too high so that people can't get into politics with their donations? If the contribution limits are at 500, that seems something reasonable for people who want to break into politics and represent the communities.
Sure.
Versus someone who...
I actually don't know the answer to that as far as an argument in front of courts. Whether keeping it low allows for more people to be involved. The problem with that is the First Amendment is not primarily concerned about the maximum amount of people running for public office. It's that it's concerned with putting limits on everybody's speech.
And then can you talk to me about the piece on the political parties? I'm trying to look that in. What would those new caps and limits be? How would that play out?
So currently you have caps at $15,000 for state parties and $5,000 for, I believe, I think district, but at least county parties, donors giving to that. That's been in place, and I'm sure Professor Jackson may have more information of why that's been in place in the past. The issue there comes with, if they can give unlimited amounts to candidates, what's the reason for having candidate contributions at all if you can just give it to the party and then they dump it into the candidate campaign? So because they can coordinate, unlike PACs, it's not an independent expenditure, you've got this uneven playing field between PACs and political parties. That said, everyone expects Republicans to support Republicans, Democrats to support Democrats. So the quid pro quo and corruption angle on that starts to get less and less. It gets more diluted as to whether I'm actually buying off Representative Penn when I give $100,000 to the state party, if there were no caps, and if that is actually accomplishing that purpose, unlike, having no limits on your personal campaign account.
Okay, and final question, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Is there any, I know we have some members in the room who are vying for these political party chairmanships and things of that nature. Is there any tether, any way for this increased amount of funding and stuff to find their way into someone's coffers who are in charge of these parties? Because it's going up 25,000, I think it is. Yeah,
More chance.
more money and more play, yeah, and more corruption.
I think the answer to that is Kansas is a small market. The money that's going to be put into Kansas on the issues is going to be in Kansas. The only thing these regulations do, I have to hat tip, I have a friend that kind of explained this to me, is just decide who gets to use that same pot of money. And the reality is these days, so much money is flowing to C4s. So much money is flowing to PACs because it's unlimited. And then you have caps on parties and candidates, and so they are engaged in less speech, and so that's why your mailboxes are bombarded with a certain type of mailer, is because the same amount of money is being, it's like having holes in the dam. You plug this over here and restrict this amount, you're gonna have more flowing out over there. And so that's really the idea. Now, that said, I'm not advocating for a free-for-all. I'm not a libertarian, but at the end of the day, I think that in 2025, you need to ask the questions that they were asking in 1990 about why we're putting these on whom, these restrictions on whom, and then factor in the case law to say that we can't just do anything we want. We can't make it artificially too low because we don't like speech. That's unconstitutional. What you have to do is balance and then be able to articulate. The AG is going to need to be able to articulate in court what the significant governmental interest is in these restrictions to get above a First Amendment threshold.
And all of these funds will be accountable, reportable, things of that nature.
Everything in this statute has to show up on a report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any burning questions for Mr. Nye, who's anxiously awaiting going to another committee? Which I won't take personally. So, okay. Our next conferee is John McGinnis, who I believe is on WebEx. Are you with us, sir? Sir, can you hear me? Sir, we're unable to hear you. Can you check your mic?
Hello, can you hear me now?
We've got you now, sir. Thank you and welcome to the
I'm
committee.
sorry.
No
Thank
problem.
you. I'm sorry about this. So thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm very grateful for your willingness to hear my testimony on this, I think, very sound bill. I'm not going to repeat what other conferees have said. My focus is going to be twofold. One, to describe why I think this bill is sound, simply because it allows more money to be spent in politics, and why it needs to be updated from the low levels that were originally put in the 1980s, and also why, in addition to the lack of a quid pro quo for parties, there are actually institutional advantages in allowing parties to provide greater amounts of funds, indeed unlimited funds, to candidates. And so I would begin, one thing I would repeat is that these limits do not even, on individual contributions, do not even get up to the amount of money that the old limits represent in today's dollars. And that leads me to my one recommendation for an amendment to the bill is that this should be indexed to inflation. That's true of the federal contributions, and that will be useful because it will mean that you don't have to come back and revisit these considerations again and again, and it will also assure that the contributions will really not, limits will not get out of whack. Whatever you think the quid pro quo is, I don't think that changes because of inflation. So it should be indexed for inflation. So why? My focus is going to be what's the advantage for democracy to allow contributions, and I think there are really quite substantial advantages actually to allow money in politics because money allows for speech in politics. And politics today, even compared to when these limits were put in the 1980s, has a lot of trouble getting its message out. In political science, there's a concept called rational ignorance, that most people, most citizens are rather rationally ignorant of politics. They don't actually focus much on it for very good reasons. Their vote is unlikely to change the result of the election. And there are many other alternatives to them, all sorts of entertainment. We're not in a world of the Lincoln Douglas debates where maybe that was the only show in town. There are many other things that they face, they can choose from. And that means that politicians need to break through that those alternatives, and that requires money. And so I think as we have more sources of entertainment, actually more money is needed in politics to inform citizens. And it does inform citizens. Again, there's a lot of social science that suggests the more money is spent on the election, the better citizens can gauge the ideological viewpoint of the various candidates. And so that's actually a big advantage to raising contribution limits. And it's also an advantage to reducing, getting rid of limits for political parties. Because one thing political parties do is they also give a shortcut for voters, again, who are very busy, about the ideology of candidates. So if a Republican candidate is endorsed by the Republican Party, voters have a sense of what that candidate believes because they have some sense of what a Republican is or what a Democrat is. And that also helps our elections by making voters more informed and actually knowing what they're voting for. So this is actually, I think these changes are really pro-democracy changes, so long as we avoid the problems of the quid pro quo that a former testimony was made of. And I don't think these limits come anywhere close to suggesting that you can buy some member for $4,000. And we've discussed before that political committee, party committees, there's really not a great danger of a quid pro quo. So those, I think, are the reasons for it. I think they're even greater today because government is also more complex today than they were in the 1980s. And so there's more reason for the public to be informed, and yet there are more alternatives of entertainments, so the public isn't going to pay really any attention or as much attention as it was previously. So these are all reasons, in addition to the First Amendment reasons described, that these kinds of increases are useful to the citizens in understanding what the positions of various candidates are. And so that's what the reason I think this bill is a really very sensible bill, not only from the First Amendment point of view, but from promoting and advancing democracy. The last thing I would say is the elimination of the limitations on political parties is also advantageous because strengthening political parties, and again, a lot of political scientists have focused on this, makes politics more coherent, more stable, because it allows for some element of party discipline in the legislature, and that allows for a less chaotic and more stable laws. If you go back to the Federalist Papers, James Madison said that stable laws were in a large part of what good laws are. So again, there are some very great advantages here, I think, of increasing the limits and particularly eliminating them for political parties that go beyond the undoubted advantage of promoting free speech values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your testimony. Our last proponent conferee is Mr. David Keating. Sir, are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Me?
We can hear you. Go ahead, sir.
Great. Well, I'm going to share my screen so you can just want to go through some slides here. Just pull it up. I hope you can see that. Can you see that?
Not yet, sir.
Not yet. Okay. Can you see it now?
Oh, here we go. Yes, sir. We can see him.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try not to repeat what the others have said already, but I want to point out that you're way below the national average on your contribution limits, both contributions from individuals to political parties, way under on that, and on candidate limits, the same thing. Just to walk you through, here are all of the 50 states, the current contribution limits to governor, and you'll see today there are only 4 states that have a lower contribution limit for governor. Now, this is expressed in a per election cycle basis because some states have per election contributions like Kansas, but other states set a contribution limit for the entire cycle. So we've normalized all of these numbers on an election cycle basis. I also wanted to point out there are 12 states that have no limits on contributions, and these are across, they're red states, they're purple states, there are some blue states. And I actually think the best way to go is to not limit contributions, but obviously that's your call. So that's the governor. There are only 4 states with lower limits. For state senate, there's only 5 states that have a lower contribution limit than Kansas. And for state house, there's only 5 states that have a lower contribution limit for state house. As indicated by a few others, even what's in the bill would not keep pace with inflation since the last time the legislature did anything with contribution limits when it delinked the House and Senate races. But you can see it would be $48.50 for governor, $24.50 for state senate, and about $1,200 for state house, rounded to the nearest $50. So you may want to at least try to keep pace with inflation since 1990. I'm not going to repeat what Professor McGinnis said. I totally agree with him. There's a lot of social science that political parties are important, and right now they're treated as a kind of a poor cousin compared to the super PACs and other organizations that speak out about candidates. So I think this bill is a big plus for free speech, a big plus for political parties to take off the contribution limits to them. I do also want to point out that a lot of people don't realize this, but most states do not limit individual contributions to political parties. And House Bill 2054 would put Kansas in that majority. And I think it's also important that parties be able to compete with super PACs and other independent organizations on campaign messaging. So this bill would do that, and it would, put Kansas, I think, more in the mainstream on contribution limits. The other thing is I totally agree with Professor Guinness that you should index whatever you decide to adopt, index it to inflation, but I wouldn't stop at indexing the contribution limits. You've got a lot of other fixed dollar amounts in your campaign finance code, including the threshold for small dollar donors. Look, in today's cancel culture, social media, everything online, when these thresholds for disclosing donors were enacted in the 1980s, there was no such thing as social media. You couldn't look up on the internet who had given to whom. And today it's all there, online. And earlier, one of the representatives asked about, the ability of getting, smaller dollar candidates. I think you've got to encourage small dollar donations by raising the thresholds for disclosure. It's at $50 right now. I think that's ridiculously low. And if you would index that to inflation, since that was adopted in 1980, that would be a big plus as well. So that concludes my remarks, and I, again, thank you for the invitation.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you for being here today. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as a proponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to open the floor for questions for any of our proponents that are still here. Is there any questions for any of the proponents? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to close proponent testimony and open neutral testimony. And the only conferee I have listed is Mr. Jeffrey Jackson. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Hello, how are you doing today? So if you don't know me, I'm Jeff Jackson. I am the James M. Kincannon Dean and Professor of Law at Washburn University School of Law, where I teach constitutional law. And my purpose for coming before you today is not as a proponent of the bill or an opponent of the bill. Really, the task that I've got today is just to kind of give you a background on how, what the Constitution has to say about these various expenditures and what, I guess, you can do as a committee and still be constitutional. So hopefully, I'll try not to make anybody fall asleep here. I mean, my students sometimes do, but that's an entirely different thing. Basically, when you talk about constitutional limits on campaign finance, it boils down to some pretty simple concepts. The first big concept is that money is speech, right? That is pretty much the bottom line idea here, which is that when you're giving money to a candidate or to a cause or to any of these things, what you're doing is speaking, right? You're using your dollars as a proxy for actually saying, I support you. Or when you're giving to a candidate, it's, I support you. When you're giving it to maybe a PAC that's doing an issue, it's, I support this particular issue. So we start with that baseline, that money is speech, which means that regulations of speech are generally disfavored and few and far between. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have regulations of this speech. There's just different tests that you have to pass. And under the Constitution, the way that they've divided that up comes from two other concepts. The two other concepts are, one, are we talking about expenditures in connection with a political party or election, right? So what we mean by that are, the technical legal term is expenditures. It's you speaking, it's your speaking on an issue or on a person. And the way they divide that up is, can the recipient of your dollars coordinate or not? Right? If the recipient of your dollars, so we're talking about these super PACs and other things, if they can't coordinate, then really what you're doing is you're talking about an issue. You're speaking about an issue. You're speaking about a candidate, and you're not speaking, or you're actually speaking in a way that is not able to be limited, right? Because it's a limitation on your speech for no good reason. If you can coordinate, then the Supreme Court has said there is an idea here that states have an interest in limiting the amount to those entities because those entities can coordinate and presumably tell the candidate, hey, this person has given you this much money, so it's a quid pro quo issue, right? So it's quid pro quo corruption issue. And they said, okay, in that certain circumstances, states have the ability to limit the amount of contributions. So those are the two big distinctions that we talk about. But they said the other thing to keep in mind is that even if it's one of these things that states can limit, if it's an expenditure that states can limit, i.e. directly to the candidate or to someone who can coordinate with the candidate, and that candidate will know this, you still have to, because it's still a restriction on speech. And even if we're going to allow it for the important purpose of avoiding quid pro quo corruption, what you still have to do, and that's really what Randall versus Sorrell was all about, is they have to be narrowly drawn. And they can't be so small, the limits you impose, that you're actually harming the electoral process because you can't allow challengers or those candidates who don't have a lot of money, who can't self-finance, you can't make them so small as to make them not able to actually challenge. So Randall versus Sorrell basically says, the limits have to be reasonable limits. They have to be reasonable to allow for the candidate to mount an effective campaign. So those are basically the ideas here, right? Those are the basic limits, the ideas, and those form, I think, the parameters of what you and the committee can do with regard to those financing laws. And that's my testimony. I'm happy to address any question because I'm a law professor and we love those.
All right, Representative Penn.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. This is just one for you. Thank you for being here, sir. And I always love to see you with the bow ties. Go Equals. Quick question. You brought up something that was good there, reasonableness of the limits. As I was discussing with an earlier conferee, the limits have always been about 500 for State House and 1,000 for Senate. Would you deem it reasonable for, even with the same footprint, amount of land, square footage, mileage, and everything like that of a district, for the increase to be on par with that of a Senate race? Would that be considered reasonable, or would that be considered constrictive for someone seeking office?
Well, so let me say this. I don't know. And the reason that I say I don't know is that the U.S. Supreme Court has not really given us a lot of great guidance on this. Their basic idea is that is a policy question, with the constitutional floor being that they cannot be so low as to prevent a challenger from mounting an adequate challenge. And I'm saying that's really the only guidance that we've got. Yeah, they didn't say, hey, dollar amounts, except in Randall, they said Vermont's too low in this situation. But I think what that amount's going to be depends on I think, individual states and what it costs and what kind of an election that it is. So I don't know from a money standpoint. That's beyond my pay grade. If you.
Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. Always nice to see Washburn in the House. So bear with me on this. It's late and my mind is going a different direction, but I have this question. So the problem I have with the bill is the removing of limits for contributions to parties, political parties. Now, after hearing the proponents, I'm kind of like, okay, I can see their point to that, and to basically allows a more fair playing field. Is there any constitutionality that would support that, such as, because now it becomes more of the right to compete, less of free speech in my mind, if that makes sense. I mean, it's like, is there more to their argument, the proponent's argument, by also looking at the Constitution in some sense?
Right, so I would say the Constitution is not as concerned with that right to compete thing. It is concerned mostly with speech, right? And the idea of not,
From one,
the idea is we're not as concerned with the money that candidates can get. We are concerned with stifling the amount that we can give, right? The speech we can engage in.
and that makes, Mr. Chair, that makes perfect sense. In my mind, I'm looking at a PAC as one legal entity, and I'm looking at the political party as also a legal entity. And so therefore, if you put restrictions on one, then it creates a fairness of competing, if that makes sense. And so I was just trying to come to grips to this as well.
Constitutionally, we're not really concerned with whether
Okay.
a PAC or can, the reason that expenditures to super PACs and the like are unlimited is because they can't coordinate. And that's the distinction that the Supreme Court has drawn. It's basically, can you coordinate with the party or not? And whatever you think about this, I myself am a little skeptical in that the distinction itself requires kind of a suspension of disbelief that says the candidate's not going to know who gave money to a PAC, when in fact they will. But there's the idea that you're giving money to a PAC, you're not giving the money to someone who can coordinate with the candidate. You're not giving the money to someone who is basically in cahoots with the candidate.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation and going down my journey of the mind. So thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Professor Jackson, it's a very helpful chart you provided. I'm just very curious. It's like
That wasn't his chart.
that's right, his chart.
It's Comfrey.
Okay, well,
Gosh darn it.
there is a chart, but
We're not helpful in the least.
okay, but the principles you outlined. For instance, the state of Colorado has much tighter limits than we do for all across the board. And then Iowa, which of course is a parallel state, has unlimited contributions. And so, I mean, are you basically saying, either of those directions, you pretty much, well, you can see problems kind of either direction. Obviously being super tight, I would guess creates its own problems like in Colorado, and then being super loose, the quid pro quo question, if the pork processors gave me $20,000, I would frankly look like I'm in their back pocket. And so, I don't know. This sort of middle course we're doing, is that kind of I take it that's the direction you think is constitutional and is best? Or should we err on the side of Iowa and just don't have any limits?
Well, I think you've correctly said that both those things are considerations, right? On the one hand, if you allow unlimited kinds of things, then there is that quid pro quo issue, as you correctly identified, and that's why the Supreme Court has said the Constitution allows you to impose limits. It doesn't mandate them, right? None of this is mandating that you impose limits. You don't have to. But they've said, yes, the Constitution can. Under the Constitution, you can impose limits. But they said also that if if you make those limits too small, they said that that could prove an obstacle, this is from Randall, they can prove an obstacle to the very electoral fairness that the state is seeking to promote. So I guess the lesson here is you, the state, if you decide as a matter of policy, thinking about those things, yes, you can definitely have limits, but they can't be too small. And as to whether one is better than the other, again, it's policy that you're talking about here, and that I don't pretend to be a policy person. I'm a constitutional law person.
Sir, following up on what you just said, I don't know if you were here when research did the rundown of the Alaska epic, but I want to make sure I understand what you're saying in connection to what we're talking about and what this talked about. The Supreme Court told the Ninth Circuit, I'm trying to restate this for confirmation or denial, the Supreme Court told the Ninth Circuit, go back and apply Randall to your decision, and when they looked at Alaska, they applied Randall, they said $500 is too low. Is that essentially what occurred in that case?
That is exactly what occurred. They said that, have you considered that these limits might be too low? The Ninth Circuit went back and said, yeah, I guess that's right. They're too low. I think, whether that's a blanket, I don't think it's a blanket thing that says $500 is too low. It just said that in the context of the elections that we're talking about, it's too low.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions for the Dean? Sir, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Go Shockers. Sorry, had to get that in there. All right. Committee, I have no other conferees listed to testify as neutral. Are there anybody else wishing to speak as neutral on this bill? Okay, seeing none. Committee, I also have nobody listed as an oral opponent. Is there anybody wishing to speak as an opponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none, I'll direct the committee's attention to the written testimony that's been submitted and is on the website. And I'm going to close the hearing on House Bill 2054. Committee, since we've got a few more minutes, I would like to try to take up House Bill 2057. And I would ask the reviser to give us an overview of that bill before I ask for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill would provide a different way for appointment to fill a vacancy in the United States Senate and the State Treasurer, Commissioner of Insurance. Currently, the governor appoints, and what this would do is establishes a procedure whereby the legislature, by the appointment of a joint committee on vacancy appointments, would get together, hold hearings and so on, come up with 5 names from the same political party that the person that vacated or where the vacancy was created, and then submit those to the full legislature. The legislature would narrow those down to 3 names. The governor then would have to pick one of those 3 names to fill the vacancy.
All right. For the purposes of discussion, the chair would entertain a motion on this bill. Representative Sutton.
Move to approve, what was the name of the number of the bill? 2057. Yeah, there you go. Move to approve 2057 as, for purposes of discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
It's been a long day. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Overall, it's a bill that I won't be able to support, and I don't think it would be too much of a surprise. But just to bring people's attentions to, I think it's incomplete. I know that Speaker Pro Tem was here. I asked him about the committee and the makeup of the committee. If we pass this as a joint committee, and I don't have a friendly amendment or anything, I would I would say that the 14 members doesn't seem to be justified upon why the 5 members of the majority party, 2 members of the minority party. Seems like that needs to be worked out. It also hasn't been proven that the system is broken, that it's been working, but yet there was a concern like, well, we didn't like, when the opportunity came, we didn't like the governor's appointment of a Democrat. And I'm also concerned, if we take ideology aside, I'm also concerned that this establishes a precedent that might have ramifications for even when there's a Republican governor, because that governor would not be able to just clearly appoint who they feel is best. They would have to adhere to this. And so I haven't been convinced that that is broken, and there's still a lot of questions to it. And so I would ask for us to not pass it out until we can work those out.
Okay. Is there any more discussion on the bill? Okay. All right. So Representative Sutton.
I close.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Sutton. You've heard the motion. All those in favor of passing out House Bill 2057 favorably signify by saying aye. All opposed, no? The ayes appear to have it. Representative Miller? Representative Miller would like his no vote recorded, as would the ranking minority member, as would Representative Neighbor and Representative Meyer. By the way, it's great to have you back here. Yes. All right. Committee, that concludes our business for today because I need to do some amendments on 2018 before we work it. Is there anything for the good of the order? All right. Seeing nothing, we're adjourned.